As I stuffed the last few items into my bags, the fluorescent lights of the Ohio gas station store flickered above me. With a pocket full of $20 bills, my hands trembled slightly. Not from shame, as I had long since abandoned that feeling, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that accompanied my hasty actions. As I made my exit, I noticed the security camera's red light blinking slowly in the corner, capturing only fragments of my hurried departure. I had learned early on how to navigate around those blind spots during my last shift, making it easier to evade detection. Earlier that night, my manager had approached me with a furrowed brow, his worn face etched with concern as he waved an audit report in the air. The paper shook in his hands, much like mine were doing now, a reminder of how sloppy I had become by taking too much at once. Spending $300 in a single night was a rookie mistake, even in a place as poorly managed as this one. The evening air bit at my skin as I rushed to my beat-up Honda Civic, parked in the darkest corner of the lot. Columbus had been good to me. 6 months was longer than I usually stayed anywhere. But like every other stop along my endless journey, it had run its course. The trunk creaked in protest as I loaded the last of my belongings. 2 duffel bags of clothes, a laptop, and a shoebox filled with various IDs, each bearing my face but different names, the essentials of a modern nomad. I headed west on Interstate 70, watching the Ohio countryside blur past my window. The dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., its dim green numbers counting down to another fresh start. Streetlights strobing across my face illuminated towns I could never return to: Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Louisville. The list grew longer with each passing year, like notches on a jail wall. The radio crackled with late-night talk shows and static, filling my car with the lonely chatter of insomniacs and truckers. I kept the volume low, just enough to drown out the whispers that had been haunting me for the past 3 years, the reminders of that fateful night. Money grew tight around Dayton, and the gas gauge needle hovered perilously close to empty. The few $100s I had managed to steal from Mike's register wouldn't last long. That's when I spotted it, a Speedway gas station emerging from the darkness like a bright oasis. The help wanted sign in the window buzzed with promise, its neon glow casting a sickly light across the empty parking lot. The boss, Greg, barely glanced up from his phone as I filled out the application, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. I wrote down references I had mastered over years of similar forms in similar places, the lies flowing easily now, each one a small brick in the wall I had built between myself and my past. When I mentioned I was available for the night shift, Greg barely acknowledged me, his thumb still scrolling through whatever had captured his attention. His disinterest was perfect, exactly what I sought in a boss. Keep the coffee fresh, don't upset the truckers, and I'd be set to start that night. I nodded, already calculating how long it would take to learn the quirks of the register, the camera's blind spots, and the manager's habits. 6 months, tops, I thought. Just enough time to build up cash for a move to the coast. Maybe even try my luck in California. New name, new story, same old plans. But as I watched Greg shuffle back to his office, a feeling of unease washed over me. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a foreign frequency, and for just a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt about the path I had chosen. I swore I saw my shadow move independently of my body, reaching toward the back room where an old receipt printer sat gathering dust. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know that some places choose you, that some bills can never be outrun. I didn't know about the printer or the rules, or how everything I'd been running from was about to catch up with me in ways I could never have imagined. The track existed in a void between places, a concrete island ringed by fields that seemed to swallow all sound during daylight hours. It was just another pit stop on an endless highway, but as darkness crept in and the moon hung low over the cornfields, the station changed into something else entirely. The windows became mirrors, reflecting the harsh interior lights and creating the unsettling image that you were being watched by a perfect copy of yourself, moving just slightly out of sync. The linoleum floor caught decades of footsteps beneath its yellowed surface, each scuff mark telling the story of another traveler going through. Sometimes, if I stared too long at the patterns, they seemed to shift and reshape themselves when I wasn't looking. My first few shifts passed in a haze of routine jobs and careful observation. I learned quickly that the security camera above Register 3 had a 3-second delay, perfect for pocketing small bills without detection. The safe in Greg's office hadn't been changed since the 90s, its combination worn lightly into the dial from years of use. All the familiar signs of an easy mark. The parade of night owls and truckers offered cover for my subtle manipulations of the cash drawer. A 20 here, a 50 there. Small enough amounts that would blend into the background noise of daily transactions. I kept a mental ledger tracking my takes with the precision of an accountant. It was almost too easy. The back room became my sanctuary during the dead hours between 3 and 4 a.m. It was a cramped room that reeked of industrial cleaner and stale cigarettes, lit by a single bulb that cast more shadows than light. Boxes of inventory made a maze of cardboard corridors, their contents spilling out like mechanical innards. And in the corner, half buried under old bills and faded warning signs, sat the printer. It was an ancient thing. Its once white plastic turned yellow with age, like old bones left in the sun. The brand name had worn away, leaving only ghostly images of letters that sometimes seemed to spell different words based on how the light hit them. Greg had mentioned it offhandedly during my training, a backup for when the main register printer failed. But something about the way he said it, how his eyes never quite looked at the machine directly, should have warned me. The first sign that something was wrong came during my 4th night. The store was empty, the only sound the gentle hum of freezers and my fingers tapping against my phone screen. The fluorescent lights overhead had settled into their usual rhythm, a soft buzz that had become almost comfortable in its consistency. Then the printer started. The sound cut through the quiet like a scream, mechanical and wrong in ways. I couldn't quite explain it. It wasn't the normal whir of receipt paper passing through rollers. This was deeper, more organic, like something breathing through machinery. The noise echoed through the empty aisles, bouncing off glass refrigerator doors and creating a disorienting choir of mechanical whispers. Before my brain could fully comprehend what was happening, my feet moved toward the back room. The door felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself had thickened. The printer's monitor was dark, dead as it had been since my first day. Yet paper was spilling from its mouth onto the dirty floor, twisting and squirming like something alive. The paper tangled around itself, forming patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. As I reached down to clear what I assumed was a simple paper jam, my fingers brushed against the ticket. It was warm, not the warmth of machinery, but the heat of something newly alive. What I read on that paper would change everything. But looking back now, I understand that the printer wasn't revealing the rules to me. It was showing me something else, something that had been waiting for someone like me. Someone running from bills that couldn't be paid in stolen cash and false names. Time moved strangely in the back room as I stared at the twisted stream of paper coming from the printer. The air felt thick, almost sticky, and carried a metallic taste that coated my tongue. Each breath seemed to take more effort than the last, as if the oxygen itself was being slowly replaced by something else. The paper was warm in my hands as I began untangling it, the texture wrong in subtle ways, too smooth in some spots, slightly rough in others, like skin that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The fluorescent light above flickered erratically, each flash casting different shadows that didn't quite match the objects creating them. At first, the text appeared faint, like words written in lemon juice, waiting to be revealed by heat. But as I watched, they began to darken and sharpen, bleeding into life as if the paper itself was birthing them. The printer's hum had changed pitch, becoming something that echoed in my teeth and made my vision blur at the edges. Rules for night shift employees. The words showed in perfect black type, too crisp and clear for a printer this old. Rule 1. Materialized slowly. If the printer starts printing on its own, do not read the receipt. Tear it off and burn it immediately. Rule 2 flashed in my mind as my fingers twitched, suddenly aware of the weight of my lighter in my pocket. I was already breaking the first rule, and the thought sent a shiver down my spine. But I couldn't stop reading as more text appeared. Rule 3 instructed me not to accept payment if the customer was wearing sunglasses after midnight. Nicely tell them the station is closed. Rule 4 emerged like ink spreading through water. If the clock on the register skips a minute, unplug the printer and wait for the power to reset. Do not look at the clock until it restarts. Each new line brought with it a drop in warmth, and I could see my breath now, making patterns in the air that didn't dissipate quite right. Rule 6 advised always to leave an unopened bottle of water on the counter before your shift ends. Rule 7, the final rule, showed all at once, the letters seeming to burn themselves into the paper. If a receipt printed with your name on it, leave the station immediately. Do not look back. I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow and fake in the small space, the sound bouncing off the walls and returning to my ears warped and stretched. This had to be some elaborate scam, probably Greg's idea of breaking in the new girl. But as I stood there clutching that impossible receipt, the printer's hum changed again, dropping to a frequency that made my bones ache. The sound reminded me of something, a memory I'd been running from for 3 years. The screech of tires, the sound of metal, and underneath it all, a similar mechanical hum that I'd heard just before everything went wrong. I shoved the paper into my pocket, trying to ignore how it pulsed against my leg like a second heartbeat. The rules were ridiculous, nonsensical. I'd worked enough night shifts to know that strange things happened after midnight. but they always had logical answers. As I walked back to the counter, something made me pause in the hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, long enough for true darkness to flood the store. In that moment, I caught my reflection in the window, except it wasn't just my mirror. Something else stood behind me, its shape almost human, but wrong in ways my mind couldn't quite process. When the lights came back on, I was alone again. That's when I noticed the register's clock. It was stuck between minutes, the numbers frozen in an impossible arrangement. In the distance, I heard the printer start to hum again. The night pressed against the gas station windows like a living thing, a darkness deeper than usual that seemed to swallow the light from the parking lot lamps. I had been at the counter for hours, my fingers dancing across bills and coins with practiced accuracy as I worked my usual schemes. Each transaction offered cover for small adjustments to the day's totals, a skill I'd mastered over years of similar jobs. The receipt paper burned against my thigh, still tucked in my pocket where I had quickly shoved it hours ago. The register's monitor glowed with sickly green digits, reading 11:45 p.m. The numbers seemed to pulse slightly, though I told myself it was just eye strain from the harsh fluorescent lighting. I had tried to rid myself of the rules twice already. The first time, the trash can had somehow moved just as I went to drop the paper in, shifting 3 inches to the left without a sound. The second time, the paper had grown so hot it nearly burned my fingers. Now it sat in my pocket like a guilty secret, radiating warmth through the fabric of my jeans. The printer had kept its silence for days, almost making me forget about those strange rules. Almost. But you don't survive as long as I have by ignoring signs, no matter how strange they seem. When you live life on the edge of legality, paranoia isn't paranoia, it's survival. At precisely 11:47 p.m., the quiet of the store was broken by the sound of the old printer screaming to life. The noise was different this time, deeper, more purposeful. It reminded me of the sound a dog makes just before it attacks, that low growl that vibrates in your chest and sparks something primitive in your brain that screams, "Run." Paper spilled onto the floor in a pale spiral, twisting like something newly born. The first rule repeated in my mind: do not read the receipt, tear it off and burn it immediately. My hand moved to my pocket, fingers brushing against the lighter I always carried, a habit left over from when I still smoked. Before that night, 3 years ago, when smoke and gasoline had mixed with devastating effects. The rational part of my brain knew this was silly. It was just a malfunctioning printer in a rundown gas station, spitting out nonsense in the middle of the night. I'd seen plenty of broken equipment in my various jobs and used many convenient malfunctions to cover my tracks. But this was different. The paper seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as I approached it. My fingers trembled as I picked up the ticket, the paper warm and slightly damp, like fevered skin. The text emerged in perfect clarity, each letter so crisp it seemed to float above the paper. 12:03 a.m. Laura, 2 gallons of gasoline, pump 6. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The station clock still read 11:48 p.m. I crumpled the ticket and threw it toward the trash, but it never reached the bin. Instead, it hung in the air for a fraction of a second before falling to the floor, unfolding itself as it fell. The text had changed. She still remembers the smell of burning gasoline, Laura. The bright lights overhead began to buzz louder, their hum syncing with the printer's distant whir. The sound built into a harmony that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Through the windows, I saw a car pull into the parking lot, a beaten-up Civic, similar to the one I had been driving 3 years ago on that rainy night. Even the dent in the passenger door matched. The clock on the register moved to 12:02 a.m. The car's driver's side door opened slowly, revealing a figure that moved with jerky, unnatural motions as they stepped into the neon glow of the station's lights. My heart nearly stopped. They wore mirrored sunglasses that reflected impossible things: flames, twisted metal, and a face I had spent 3 years trying to forget. The printer roared again, louder this time, as if it were laughing. 12:03 a.m., 2 gallons, pump 6. The past had finally caught up with me, wearing sunglasses after midnight. Time stretched like melted plastic as the figure stood motionless by their car. The sunglasses mirrored the station's fluorescent glare, forming miniature galaxies of light that swirled and twisted in impossible ways. December wind whipped through the empty parking lot, but their clothes didn't move. Not even a wrinkle, not even a breath. Rule 2 hammered in my head like a pain. Do not accept payment if the customer is wearing sunglasses after midnight. Such a simple rule, such a specific warning. Now I understood why their shadow stretched across the cracked asphalt, but something was wrong with it. While the figure remained model still, their shadow writhed and twisted, its edges blurring and remaking themselves into forms that hurt my eyes to look at. Sometimes it looked like flames, sometimes like twisted metal, sometimes like a body being pulled from a wreck. I had dealt with my share of strange customers during endless night shifts across the country. The meth addicts with their paranoid rants, the drunks who couldn't quite remember how they got there, the ones running from things worse than what I was running from. But this was different. Every movement they made was too exact, too calculated, like someone who had studied human behavior but never quite mastered it, like a puppet being controlled by strings I couldn't see. When they finally moved toward the door, their feet never seemed to quite touch the ground. The bell above the door, the annoying tiny thing that had chimed every time someone entered for the past week, remained silent. On the security monitor, their image showed as a smear of static, a human-shaped hole in reality. The air grew thick and cold as they approached the counter, the metallic taste from the back room filling my mouth again, mixed with something else, the bitter smell of gasoline and burning tires, the same smell that had filled my lungs 3 years ago as I crawled from the wreckage. "Keep the change," they said, sliding a 20 across the counter. Their voice was wrong, layers of sound that didn't quite sync up, like multiple people speaking almost, but not quite, in harmony. Behind those mirrored lenses, I caught images of things that might have been eyes, but weren't. Couldn't be, because eyes don't move like that. They don't fragment and rejoin like kaleidoscope patterns. I shouldn't have taken the money. The rule had been clear, but years of instinct, years of taking whatever I could get, made my hand reach out. The bill felt wrong against my skin, too warm, like the ticket had been, like flesh. As they turned to leave, they paused. Their head moved too far, too smoothly, bones and muscles working in ways human structure shouldn't allow. "She misses you, Laura." The words froze my blood. 3 years of running, of changing names and places, of trying to forget. Nobody here knew about her. Nobody knew about that night, about the fight, about my decision to drive after those last 2 shots. Who are you? The question scraped out of my throat like broken glass. They smiled, and their teeth were all wrong. Too many, too sharp, grouped in patterns that suggested a geometry that shouldn't exist in our world. Check the printer, they said, their voice now a symphony of discordant whispers. Then they walked out into the darkness, each step leaving short impressions of char on the linoleum. I looked down at the 20 in my hand. It had crumbled to ash, leaving behind the faint smell of burnt flesh and a small scrap of paper with familiar handwriting. Why did you leave me there, Laura? The words were written in Sarah's handwriting, the same handwriting I'd last seen on the note she'd left on my window hours before our final drive. The register clock read 2:13 a.m. when truth started to unravel. I had been avoiding looking at it since the event with the midnight visitor, keeping my eyes fixed on the scratched counter surface, the dusty shelves, anywhere but those sickly green digits. But time has a way of demanding attention, especially during the midnight shift, when minutes stretch like taffy. The fluorescent light above Register 3 had been flashing more than usual, not the normal steady pulse of dying bulbs, but in a rhythmic stutter that seemed to follow my heartbeat. Or maybe my heartbeat was following it. The difference had started to blur, much like everything else in this place. The printer had been quiet since the Ash Money event, but its presence felt heavier somehow, as if it were waiting for something to happen. The silence from the back room had a weight to it, like something gathering power, waiting. The air had grown thick with the smell of ozone and hot plastic, making each breath feel like inhaling static. I blinked just once, a fraction of a second, and the clock moved from 2:13 to 2:15 a.m. 1 minute gone, vanished like smoke, like the $20 bill, like Sarah on that rainy night. Rule 3 rang in my mind with crystal clarity. If the clock skips a minute, unplug the printer and wait for the power to restart. Do not look at the clock until it restarts. My hands trembled as I turned toward the back room. The printer's hum had changed into something else entirely, a sound that made my molars ache and my vision swim. It reminded me of the noise a car's engine makes just before it dies, that last desperate wheeze before everything goes silent. The cord felt warm under my fingers, almost alive, like gripping a snake as I pulled it from the wall. Darkness swept through the store like a flood. The emergency lights, which should have kicked in automatically, stayed dead. The darkness was absolute, the kind that makes you question if your eyes are even open. In that perfect blackness, I heard footsteps in the back room, not the hurried steps of someone trying to rob the place. I'd heard those before and knew how to handle them. These were slow, deliberate, each step marked by a wet sound, like something ripping itself off the floor. They moved with a precision that suggested whoever, or whatever, was making them had all the time in the world. "Hello?" I called out, my voice small and wrong in the thick darkness. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any sound could have been. Then something clicked, a mechanical sound that wasn't quite mechanical enough. The printer's display flickered to life, leaving a sickly glow that illuminated nothing but itself. Numbers that weren't numbers scrolled across its screen, making patterns that hurt to look at. A receipt revealed the text, glowing with its own pale light. 2:17 a.m. Someone is behind you. I felt breath on my neck, cold as a morgue freezer. It carried the smell of gasoline and burned flesh, the same smells that had filled my nostrils as I crawled away from the wreck, leaving Sarah stuck in the passenger seat. You should have checked if I was still breathing. Sarah's voice whispered, but it wasn't quite Sarah's voice anymore. It had an echo to it, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well filled with metal bits. You should have tried to help me. Instead, you ran. You always run, Laura. I wanted to turn around. Part of me needed to see what was standing there in the darkness, breathing that cold breath on my neck. But I remembered the rules. Looking back was never allowed. Looking back meant facing what you'd done, what you'd left behind. The backup engine finally kicked in with a roar that sounded too much like human screams. Light flooded back into the store, harsh and unforgiving. I was alone again, but the linoleum floor behind me was marked with wet tracks that smelled of gasoline and antifreeze. The printer had reset itself, its panel now showing the correct time, 2:18 a.m., but taped to its side was a Polaroid. I knew I'd burned the last photo of Sarah and me years ago, the one taken hours before the crash. As I watched her face in the picture turn toward mine and smile, her teeth too sharp, her eyes reflecting printer display numbers that shouldn't appear, I felt a chill run down my spine. The rules had become my religion by the end of that week. Each night before leaving, I'd place an empty bottle of water on the counter, third tile from the register, label facing the door. The fluorescent lights would catch in the liquid, making rippling patterns across the grimy linoleum floor that never quite matched the movement of the water inside. That night felt different from the moment I stepped into the store. The air hung strangely still, like the pause between heartbeats. Even the steady hum of the refrigerator seemed muted, as if something was absorbing all sound before it could fully form. The aisles stretched longer than usual, their ends fading into shadows that shouldn't exist under bright lighting. I had gotten the process down to a science. Count the drawer, log the sales, set the alarm, place the water. Simple steps that kept whatever lurked in the printer's realm at bay. The bottle had to be new, unused, the seal unbroken. I'd learned that lesson the hard way 2 nights ago when I'd tried to leave a bottle I'd taken just one sip from. The security video showed nothing, but I found it the next morning. Plastic twisted and melted, the water inside turned to something thick and dark that smelled of rust and regret. Tonight's gift was perfect. Crystal clear water, untouched, pristine. I placed it in its spot with the precision of a holy ritual. The label facing exactly 47 degrees east. Another thing I'd learned mattered, though I couldn't say how I knew when the angle was wrong. The shadows behind the counter grew teeth as I collected my things to leave. Movement caught my eye. The bottle had moved just slightly, maybe an inch to the left. I blinked, and it was back in its original place. My heart pounded against my ribs as I remembered all the other bottles I'd left, each one gone by morning shift. I never asked Greg what happened to them. Some questions are better left unasked, especially when the answers might come in the form of receipt paper marked with impossible numbers. But tonight, something made me stay. I pretended to count the register again, my shaky fingers moving through the motions, while my eyes watched the bottle from the corner of my vision. The station lights flickered once, twice, and in that split second of darkness, I saw it. A hand emerged from between the shadows cast by the neon lights. It was long, pale, with too many joints in the fingers, moving with a liquid grace that suggested bones were optional. The fingers wrapped around the bottle like pale snakes, and where they touched the plastic, it began to ripple as if it were melting. The water inside started to boil, but not from heat. It writhed like something alive, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. Faces I recognized from accident reports and newspaper pieces I'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I ran. It wasn't the first time I'd run from something I didn't want to see, and muscle memory took over. But as I reached my car, the radio crackled to life without being turned on. Through bursts of static, I heard a voice that sounded like Sarah, but processed through machinery. "The water is for passage, Laura. Each bottle buys another night of running, but you can't run forever. Even receipt paper has an end." The next morning, Greg noted how the night shift replacement had quit suddenly, leaving a note about personal reasons. His eyes wouldn't meet mine as he said it, and I noticed his hands shook slightly as he sorted through the morning's tickets. I didn't ask about the bottle, just like I didn't ask about the small puddle of water by the register that seemed to follow my movements in the mirror, or why it smelled faintly of gasoline and tears. When I left that morning, I checked my rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the back seat, a figure made of receipt paper and water, its lines blurring like ink in rain. But when I looked again, there was only a small puddle on the seat and a receipt that read, "The next bottle won't be enough. Some bills require more than water to clean." It was natural, really. People like me, we don't get clean getaways. Every shortcut comes with a cost. Every escape leaves a trail. The printer knew this from the start, had been carefully collecting my debts like an accountant from hell. The receipt it spat out at 2 a.m. was different from the others. Most ticket paper feels thin, cheap, disposable. This felt like skin beneath my fingers, warm and slightly damp. The text appeared slowly, bleeding up from beneath the surface, like bruises rising on a body you thought you could outrun. "It's time to give something back," it read, the words shimmering with a sinister glow. The air in the store grew thick with the smell of gasoline and burning plastic. In the security monitor's mirror, I saw Sarah standing behind me, not the Sarah from before the accident. This Sarah was different. Her skin had the feel of thermal paper, her hair moved like smoke, and her eyes were registration marks, perfectly lined crosses that held the answer to everything I'd been running from. "The printer knows what you owe," she said, her words coming from the machine rather than her mouth. "It's been figuring the interest for 3 years. Would you like to see your final balance?" I didn't want to look, but like every other rule I'd broken in my life, I couldn't help myself. The last ticket was already printing, and this one would show exactly what it would cost to settle my account. The real question was, would I finally stop running long enough to pay it?